The title of the session is Behavior Cadre, and my name's Dionne. So the purpose of the Behavior Cadre is just to provide some quarterly time together to think about behavior and supports. And so I'm going to give credit to the State Behavior Task Group. So it's the State Special Education Regional Technical Assistance Center groups have worked together and created a specially designed instruction toolkit. So we're going to talk about behavior, and then we're going to use that SDI toolkit. And then at the end, we're going to practice how we might use that toolkit in every day. So thinking about behavior, we know that there are some common challenging behaviors that we face in schools every day. And so on the screen, you'll see that there's just some of the ones that we think about, those behaviors that we deal with pretty regularly. And some of those may be more extreme behaviors like hitting or kicking or biting, those physical. But a lot of times we have students out of their seat or elopement. They're in places they don't need to be, or they're out of the room. A lot of this challenging behaviors is when a student just calls out. They don't wait their turn. They're disruptive in the class. We may have outbursts, screaming. We may have lots of times when we have students that are off task, or they're not completing their work, or it takes them an extended amount of time to begin that task, even after the teacher prompt. We have kids that, that emotional regulation. We have kids that damage property. They write on desk, or they damage computer equipment. And then we have some behaviors that are following directions, that students have trouble with following directions. So what we know is there's a whole gamut of challenging behaviors that we deal with every day in the school setting. One of the things that we have to just think about then is what are those behaviors? We have to identify what that specific behavior is. We have to make sure that it's observable. Can we see that? Could someone come in and model that, see that exact behavior because we've defined it so clearly? And then objective. So let's start thinking about some of those common behaviors that we have in the school, and then we're going to move forward for looking at some of that specially designed instruction that we can see. How can we teach the students? And so we think about this ABC model, and you probably hear this a lot. And we think about this model because, it's really the framework for how we think about the behavior and the function of behavior, why the behaviors occur, the frequency, the settings in which those behaviors occur. But we start thinking about the first thing really is those environmental factors. Think about the background setting. Think about the setting event that occurred. So thinking about, let's say you have a student that come into school and they're angry, and they're frustrated, and they're mad when they're at school. Maybe something happened that morning. Maybe something happened the night before with their family. So they come in with this heightened level of frustration or more anxious than usual. And we start thinking about what are the things that kids come to school with. And then we start thinking about what we call the ABC contingency, and what the antecedent is. That's what the A is for, and the antecedent. And that just tells us what's happening right before that behavior occurs. And we have to think about that. And sometimes when the behaviors occur, that's a very rapid response that we have to think about. So when we're watching and observing behaviors, we think about what happens right before a behavior occurs. What is that behavior? And then what's that consequence? What happens after that behavior occurs? For example, so the teacher assigns students 25 math problems to work on independently. And so the student knocks the paper off the desk and throws it in the floor. And then the teacher sends the student to the principal's office. So we have to think about those were all of the things that happen. So the antecedent is the teacher asked the student to complete some task. The student then throws his paper away. And then what happened is that consequence is what we have to think about, is what happened. Well, the student was able to get out of completing the math assignment, right? Because they were able to get to the principal's office. So we have to really think about the root and the cause of the behavior. And that's sometimes, again, we think about that. It's sometimes difficult because we're in that rapid cycle of those behaviors happening. We're managing many behaviors at one time. And so, it helps us to just kind of frame that and think about it. So what we know is that we have to think about, why those behavior occurs, and we have to think about the function of a behavior. And that's always a good starting point. We may have students that have an IEP, and they have an emotional behavior disorder. They have behavior goals. We have to think about why those behaviors are occurring, and then how can we design our instruction. We are writing IEP goals around that behavior, and then how are we going to teach that student specifically to address the behavior. The big thing is that we really have to think about how we operationally define a behavior. And so we think about, if we say the word like students out of seat. Okay, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be out of the seat? Are they at the pencil sharpener? Are they standing beside of their seat? Are they moving over to another group to work? Or are they at another table? Or are they at the locker? And in order for us to be able to monitor that, we have to really define what that looks like. So let's say we're out of seat at locker 7 times during class, right? So then we can measure it. We have to think about what the behavior is, then we can measure it. So we can check the frequency of that behavior. We can understand where that student is at. Is it all over the classroom? Is it just in one spot? Is it moving over to a group where their peers are at? So those are all things that we think about in that model of trying to really define what a behavior is occurring and then how we're going to provide interventions. So on this slide, we think about the ABCs of behavior, and we have to ask those questions. Why does the behavior continue to occur? So this one is like, we think about it is when blank happens, then the student does this. So what happens right after that, and you'll see that one next on the slide, is a consequence, right? And that's the why. So we really are thinking about when a behavior happens, the student does this, and this is why they are doing it. And that helps us figure out what those functions, again, what those are. Now, we have to think about, is it a demand of the teacher? Is it a particular task that we're doing? Is it a particular class that we're in? Does the student have a full understanding of what the assignment is, or what the prompt is that the teacher has delivered? And then we have to think about, then what is it that the student does? Are they disruptive? Again, are they throwing their pencil on the floor? Are they knocking the books off the shelf? And then what is that consequence? What is that consequence? And so we have to think about when we, how often does that behavior happen? And then how many times did it occur? And so we have to think about making, it's not the consequence right now we're going to have to think about how we respond to that around maintaining those consequences. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So we know that behavior happens. We have a problem behavior, and it is for one of 2 reasons. Students are either going to try to get something, or they're going to try to avoid or escape something. So in the example we talked about just a minute ago with the student that was assigned 25 math problems. So the student was assigned 25 math problems, and so he knocks his book to the floor. And the teacher says, pick up your book, and he says, no. So teacher sends him to the principal's office. What is he trying to avoid? Right, he's trying to avoid math. So thinking about students, there could be a couple, they're probably trying to escape or avoid something, right? So imagine students that you have, and they're struggling with the concept in mathematics, and you give them 25 problems to do on their own. There's probably some things that's happening at that point. They maybe are not clear on the task. Maybe they're overwhelmed by the number of problems that we've given them. Maybe they don't have a strategy for starting the task. Maybe they have a goal, or they're working on getting started on the task. So there's some things that maybe they need some extra help with. So the behavior is really giving us a clue about the student, and are they ready to solve the problem, and are they going to need some more supports? But remember, when we think about it, there's a function of behavior. It is always either to get something or to avoid or escape. And so if we keep that in mind, what is it that they're trying to get out of? Is it something sensory? Is it like, I had a student one time that he hated to go in the gym, right? So if we had a program and we didn't have him go in the gym first and kind of prep him for the program, he would get in trouble, or he would, kick the bleachers or rock on the bleachers. But the sensory was too much for him. There's too much noise and there's too much stimulation. So he would avoid or escape, and he would behave badly so that he would be taken out of the gym. And the same thing, thinking about, are they trying to get social reinforcement, or are they trying to escape being embarrassed? The other thing is, the tangible or the activity. We have to just try to think about the purpose and why a student is behaving that way. And that really gives us a clue into how we write a goals for that child and how we provide specially designed instruction. So if we continue to see a behavior, for example, in the math we used, teacher gives the student an example, 25 problems to solve, student knocks the books on the floor, teacher sends the student to the principal's office. Well, every time the student's asked to do a task that involved, maybe they're overwhelmed, or it seemed impossible for them to be able to do, or they don't have the skills to be able to do that independently, let's say he's going to do the same thing, right? He's going to knock his books off on the floor. He's going to throw his papers down. He's going to do something, because we're continuing to reinforce that. The teacher's sending them to the office. And that's that's when we start thinking about what is it we're going to do different. So if he's going if we're sending him to the office every time, is he still have to solve the problems? Is he have to come back at a different time during the day and work out the math problems? Because if we continue to reinforce it, the behavior is going to continue. So let's think about that. So we're aware then that a student might present with us that has a goal or a behavior goal that we know is a problem for that student. So they have an IEP, and we have a goal that we've written for that student. We have to start thinking about this student. What is it exactly that we're going to do? So we were thinking about if we want students to learn, we're going to have to teach that, right? So a lot of times our behavior plans don't work or don't work out for us because we miss this piece here. And this is the piece in the specially designed instruction. And I know many of you thinking about how we set up classroom structures or classroom procedures. All of those things we have to teach. And for our students who struggle, we're going to have to continue to teach those, and we're going to have to continue to revisit those. And if a kid has a cognitive deficit and we've been off any amount of time, we're going to have to revisit those classroom procedures and rules as well. So it's the same thing when we start thinking about the effective behavior instruction. What are we going to do special for that student to help improve that behavior? So these are some things that we need to teach. We have to teach them and identify how we're going to replace that behavior. Are we going to give them a replacement behavior? Are we going to give them some skills that they need in order to, they may not have enough skills if it's interacting appropriately, that we may have to teach them more about communicating with others and how to interact in a group before we can get to that desired behavior. We're going to have to teach some skills. We may have to think about, the first thing we're going to do is have to model that. And sometimes we think that might seem a little out of character, but really the teacher, we have to model that as the adults, and then we get them to practice it, and then we give them an opportunity to practice on their own. What we know is that sometimes students are not going to maintain that behavior, and to change behavior, it's going to take time. It's going to take lots of practice and time, and it's going to take time for feedback, both positive and corrective feedback. So I know that there's been instances before we've talked with teachers and they put together a behavior plan for a student, and we said, they say, okay, we've implemented the behavior plan. And so we might say, okay, how long have you implemented that behavior plan? And they'll say 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, and they're not seeing a significant change in behavior. And what we know is it's going to take some time for us to teach that. And again, thinking about a kid that might have a cognitive deficit, that we've been away from school for any amount of time, we have to just go back and reteach that. And I know many of you have said, I've modeled that and taught that 100 times, but sometimes we just have to go back and revisit those things again. And so that's another thing we have to always plan for and think about. What are opportunities that we can model that, and then give them some practice with it, and then give them some feedback. And then the other thing is, how do we teach that skill in that environment where they're usually in the school setting, right? Because we're also trying to think about how are we getting all of the Kentucky academic standards in that classroom? How are we completing assignments and all of the work that happens in the school? Plus, we're modeling and teaching behavior. So I wanted to share with you, this is the Center for Instruction and Behavior Research. And there's a little video here I wanted to share with you all. And this is Dr. Terry Scott, who just did a session for us at KVEC, but he models what we're talking about. Look, a kid who's modeling or who's calling out in class. And I'm going to show you this real quick video, and we can talk about that in just a second.
Okay, guys, we're getting ready to go. I want to remember a couple of things. First of all, when we go down the hall for lunch, do we walk or do we run?
Walking.
Okay, that's correct, Jim, but we're going to be raising our hands. So there's one time this morning that you haven't. But that is correct, we're walking. Here's my next question. When we're walking down the hall, should we have an outside voice or an inside voice? What is it? Inside voice. Good job raising your hand there, Jim. There's one you raised your hand there this time. So 1-1, good job. All right, one more question before we go. When we get down to the cafeteria, should we run in or should we wait in line at the door? Thanks for raising your hand, everybody. Jim, that's the second time you raised your hand. Great. What's the answer?
Wait in line at the door.
Wait in line at the door. That's right. Excellent job. Okay, so let's get ready to go. That was 2-1. Great job this morning, Jim.
And let's talk just a little bit about what we saw in that model. You saw immediate feedback. So we see the rewarding the positive behavior. So it really didn't disrupt instruction, but he continued to acknowledge the student. And the other day, Dr. Terry Scott did a training for us, and he said generally for every negative behavior, you want to give 4 times a positive. So those things, when we're talking about that, he was giving him, there was opportunities to practice that in that natural environment. So that's what we're talking about when we're saying, okay, what is that going to look like in that natural environment? So he taught the skill, and remember, he's also, we're addressing the students with that, the student about calling out, but he was also reinforcing, he was reminding the students or pre-teaching that behavior about how do we walk in the hallway? What do we do when we line up? Those things we have to continuously reinforce and praise kids. So that praising them for that appropriate behavior still serves a function of the behavior. So they get recognition for what they're doing correct. And so those are good ways that we think about shifting the way we call on students, how we model, giving them the opportunities to practice. So I think those are, again, if we just kind of shift the way we think through addressing those problem behaviors, we have to really define what that behavior is. And so in this particular instance, the student was calling out. And again, like I said, I can remember, we have that every day. Kids are calling out. We try to teach them to raise their hand, but then they forget or they don't use that because they're reinforced. So if they keep raising their hand, and you've seen people laying over on their desk, kids laying over on their desk with their hand raised, right? They're trying to get some kind of recognition or acknowledgement from the teacher. They're trying to get attention. And so they'll do other things to get attention if those things don't work. But he was able to reinforce that and give that praise for corrective behavior. So good, that was great. So let's think about it. We have to have a plan for how we're going to replace behaviors. So sometimes we start with a replacement behavior, right? So we think we've got this problem behavior. What's the desired behavior? And then we have the ideal behavior. But let's think about this. If we're going to replace a behavior, let's think about what's the behavior you want them to have? What are the skills or the prerequisite skills that they might need? And then we're going to get the appropriate behavior. So I think about that. So let's think about a student that calls out, for example. So we want the student to raise their hand instead of calling out. So the desired behavior is raising a hand. But what skills are they going to need prior to being able to raise their hand? Think about if that child lives in a home where the only way they can get attention is to call out, right? Who's the loudest? Who makes the most noise? Who talks over everybody else? Those are some skills. So we're going to have to talk about how do we interject in the conversation appropriately. So when we're thinking about how we provide instruction and what's specially designed instruction for that student, we have to break down that desired behavior into some prerequisite skills. Do I have to understand how to interrupt politely, or I have to understand when it's appropriate to raise my hand, or I have to understand some of those back skills before I'm ever ready to do the appropriate behavior. And so those teach them how to integrate those skills within the academic setting, but also, with managing social situations. So when we teach a replacement behavior, we're really trying to think about it has to serve that function as the problem behavior, right? It has to have the same thing. If we're replacing that behavior with something else, it has to give them the function. It either has to get them, they have to be praised or acknowledged, or they're trying to get out of something. So we have to make sure that we align behaviors that we want to teach them appropriate with the behavior that we're trying to change. So we have to think about who, what, when, where, and why. And I know those are really, when you, in the context of a school setting and how things happen so quickly and in a school day and how many behaviors we're trying to address in a particular class setting in one time, that's a lot to manage and to try to integrate. But when we have that plan together, we understand why the student's doing it, what the function of that behavior is. It's to get out of something or to get something. What's happening before, if it's a task that I'm asking the student back, like for the math example, I'm asking the student to solve 25 problems and the student throws their books in the floor. I have to think about what's the antecedent, what's happening. Well, I'm giving them 25 problems. Well, how am I going to change that, right? I'm going to have to teach them, either I'm going to reduce the number of problems I give them, I'm going to look at what supports they need to get started on tasks. So all of those things, because I'm trying to replace the behavior with an appropriate behavior.
Yeah, Dionne, I was just going to say some of those prerequisite skills, they're going to have to understand. They have an understanding of the classroom rules, and be able to pick up on the social, cues there, and then, just having listening skills sometimes, and impulse control. Those are things that can, be a prerequisite to teaching them to raise their hand to ask a question. And so those are things you want to think about as you build your goals, that those are, some of those stair steps to achieving that goal may need to be built into your short-term objectives.
No, I think that's great, Dean Paul. Thank you, because you're exactly right. Self-regulation, that impulsiveness, and what kind of strategy do I replace that? Maybe I'm doing a stop and think, and I teach them to stop and think, is this, or check in on how am I feeling at this time, right? There's all kinds of different things, and every child's so different. We do have to think, though, what is those prerequisite skills it takes to be a successful student in that classroom? How does the student need some support on regulating? They may have issues with executive functioning, right? And they're having trouble with organization. So it goes back to the same way we think about an academic goal and what is it that we want them to be able to do? And then what are those skills? Just like if I want them to be able to infer, then I have to teach them to ask who, what, when, where, and why questions. So I'm going to be scaffolding and breaking those skills into smaller chunks so they can do that. And with behavior, we have to think of it the same way. If this is the behavior we want them to be able to exhibit in the classroom, what are those smaller sub-skills or those prerequisite skills that they need to have mastery over before they can be independent with that? And we're going to have to model it. We're going to have to give them an opportunity to practice it. And then we're going to have to give them some feedback. And we're going to have to continuously cycle through those things. So thinking about our goals, when we're thinking about how we write those annual goals for behavior. And I think that's one of the most challenging areas for us in IEPs is what do we do when we write those goals, and what are the things that we don't want to put in that goal? And you think about combining multiple skill deficits. When we are operationally defining a behavior, that we have to really figure out what that particular behavior is. And when we put multiple skill deficits in a goal, we're going to have to measure each variable, and it's really difficult to do that. It's going to be hard to pinpoint exactly what specially designed instruction they need if we just put a bunch of things in there that we're going to work on. So, we want to have to think about what those sub-skills are and that skill we want them to have, and not put a whole lot of things in there. And we want to make sure that what's an appropriate amount of time that the student can be working on that, and we have to make it reasonable. So, and this next one, you see, we don't want to do is use that same IEP goal year after year after year. And if we use that same behavior goal year after year after year, it's going to look like that we're not providing FAPE, but it's also going to look like that's not reasonable for that student, and that we're not having a reasonable expectation for success for that student. So that's the other thing we want to think about, that we're changing that because we're trying to address that behavior. And we may have one skill that they have to work on for a little bit. And then the next year, maybe it's something else that we're going to be working on. So we have to think about what's reasonable for that year, but also how can we measure it? How can we, how we're going to measure that? Can we progress monitor it? And are we going to make any changes, instructional changes? Because if we keep using the same old goal every year after year, we know that we've not really demonstrated shifts in our instruction or our modeling or how we're helping students attain that goal. Deepa, is there anything you want to add about that, about goals, behavior goals?
Yeah, I just think sometimes it's important to think about what we're going to teach the students in chunks and in small manageable pieces. And so getting away from sometimes thinking that we need to use numbers to stair step those percentages within those short-term objectives, we really need to think about the prerequisite skills, and that's what I was getting at with this particular example that you're using. Is sometimes the student's not going to be able to achieve that goal unless we break those parts down, much like Chastity would teach in reading, or you would teach in the writing process. There's building blocks to those, to being able to have the student to attain that. And we have so many students that come into our schools, and we get big questions around the fact that this student can't meld into the routine. They cannot function in a structured environment. And so we have to teach them how to do that, because they, like Dr. Bates said, it's very clear there that sometimes they come from environments where they are not expected to behave a certain way, or they don't have that structure. So we have to teach that. And then also we have students that have disabilities that impact that behavior, like the students that have autism, that may not understand without some explicit teaching of the schedule and whatnot. So those are things that we just have to consider. And I think getting back to that, good teaching is good teaching, and explicit instruction is right at the top. And you guys know I love that.
I'd just like to say something, Danny and Paul. This is Tony Isaac, and you've known each other for a while.
Yes.
Just to talk on the behavior part, just something I've seen work for me. I don't know if it might help somebody else. Is one kid stands out of my mind. Certain behaviors. I had a kid years ago, obviously, was cursing all the time, like just constantly. And I knew the family, and come to find out, the regular teachers obviously was putting him out of class. He was getting rolled up, this and that, and he was getting mad about it. The reason he's getting mad about it, that's the way everyone in his family spoke all the time. So I had to sit down with him and just explain to him, you're not wrong. You're not a bad person. Your family are not bad people. It's just like, I know you went to church. It's like, well, do you cuss when you're in church? And he's like, well, no, I'm in church. I said, well, you're in school. We don't do that in school. I said, it's not that it's wrong. It's just, we don't do it in school.
We appreciate that very much, Tony. Very, very clearly, it's important to, establish those relationships. And I think part of that is, understand where that student's coming from, and knowing the background, and sometimes, if they are exhibiting those behaviors, then we take some more steps to find a little bit more out, and think about it a little bit differently, and try to find a way to be able to teach them what's socially acceptable.
Absolutely, because that's exactly what you're. Some things are appropriate in a school setting. Some things are not appropriate in a school setting. And kids that don't have models or examples of that, they may not know what's appropriate. And so that might be a sub skill or a skill that we have to, when is it appropriate? How do we behave at school? When is it appropriate to use certain words? Is it appropriate? And helping them to understand that. Because a lot of times, you think about students that have autism, and you think about that communication deficit and that social deficit, right? That could happen with any of our kids. There's those barriers. They don't know when that's appropriate and not. So you may have to go back and teach that and practice it. And I think about that, Kim Howard just did a training for us from the Kentucky Autism Training Center, and that's what she was talking about, revisiting those goals. But they also have like what's appropriate in the hallway. Do I have to keep my hands to myself? Because they had a student that was touching kids all the way down the hallway. And so other kids were getting offended by that, or they were frustrated because, or the kid would run their hands down the lockers all the way down the hallway. And so they had to understand what was appropriate behavior, and they had to practice and teaching those prerequisite skills. Remember, we don't use those words at school. Or remember, let's use school words, right? Appropriate for schools. Right? So when we're thinking about how we work on goals, when we're just thinking about a behavior, we got to think about how we're going to measure it, and then how we're going to make sure that students making progress. And a lot of times we'll have issues with goals and measuring that because we've not clearly defined it on the front end of that. And so we're thinking about what should we do with our goals and our IEP goals around those behaviors. So we're thinking about what are some of the results that we want to have change in this behavior that could happen over the course of the year. We're not restating standards, but we should have specific skills or strategies that the student should be able to do, and it has to pass the stranger test. So when you're defining a behavior, think about the stranger test. Could anyone pick that up? And you have defined that behavior so well that anybody could understand what that behavior is. So let's start thinking about it. So we think about goals that we have identified for students that have behavior needs. All right, so let's start thinking about specially designed instruction. And again, that's one of the areas that's more difficult because we have a lot of academic resources for academics. And if we're thinking about how do we do instruction in math or reading or writing. So behavior is often challenging. So when we think is specially designed instruction is our methodology. It's planned, it's designed, it's initially delivered by the special education teacher. We deliver it because we have to monitor progress. We want to have them accessing the general curriculum. We think about the Kentucky academic standards. We think about early childhood standards. We think about assistive technology devices, what they might need. So that's all around the specially designed instruction. What does that look like then in the area of behavior? Right? We think we got all these high leverage practices. We have these evidence-based instructional practices. And then we move into the behavior and we don't have as much support. So we've got some resources and tools that we're going to share with you today. So when we think about differentiated instruction, and that is really trying to meet the needs of all different learners in the class. We might do that through scaffolding. We might do that through small group instruction. But what we're doing with differentiated instruction is, again, we're trying to make sure that we have access. But when we're thinking about specially designed instruction, we're thinking about how kids can have access and how we can measure their progress. So behaviors have to be measurable. They have to be measurable, they have to be objective, and they have to be clear so that we're knowing exactly what that problem behavior is and how we're going to determine if the student's making any progress. If it's a student that's having trouble time on task and they're not starting task appropriately, at an appropriate time after the teacher gives the prompt. And we're measuring, we're giving them skills or working on skills, we're working on resources, we're giving them tools in order to be able to be independent to solve problems. And we're going to measure, is the student able to start task? It reduce the number of minutes? If it took 7 minutes to start the task, are we at 5 minutes? Are we at 4 minutes? Right? So that can tell us, it gives them access, but we're also looking at progress. And so on this right here, we have to think about what are the goal and the areas of concern, what are the problem indicators, what's the function of the behavior, and then think about the student's abilities. And you think if there's a cognitive deficit, that may have an impact on the appropriate specially designed instruction. If it's a student with autism and they have a communication deficit, we think about that also. So we're considering, how do we teach this child that's appropriate to that child, and what special instruction can we give them in order for them to make progress? And so on this page right here, you'll see this is the behavior toolkit, and this is what we're going to use for our the rest of our activities. So this is where I'll give credit to the Kentucky Special Education Regional Technical Assistance Centers. They have a statewide network of behavior consultants that come together, and they work together to put this document, make it available for teachers in the classroom to help us to select and choose specially designed instruction for particular behaviors. So while you're opening that, I'm going to move to this slide here. And this is just thinking about all those, we're talking about tier 1 when we're talking about behaviors. And what are those universal strategies? What are those, that starts with we expect 80%. And that would be around those. How do we teach those behavior expectations, rules and routines, all the things that every student gets? How do we provide supervision? How do we provide praise? How do we let kids be engaged and give them opportunities to respond and provide feedback? When we move to tier 2, there's more intensive supports. And so in that document, you'll see, and you can mark that and hold that in there. You can see what those different tiers of intervention are. And a lot of times you may have a student that's being referred. You can use this document also in that pre-referral and referral process around what is it that we're using, what behavior strategies are we using, evidence-based strategies to improve that behavior, prior to referral. So this can also be used in that process, and you can share that with the general education teachers and help them to have ideas about what to do with interventions. So on this document, you can see that this one, the first one, when you open it up, you'll see it's the task completion and the on-task behavior. So this one is, you're trying to get them, either complete their task or to be on task. And you can look there, under the problem indicators, you see they're either not starting or taking or responding to directions, or they're not completing the work. If they're having trouble maintaining focus, or they're up and down out of their seat, or causing a distraction in the class. But that's how you can look to see, those are some of the problem indicators. So if a student is presenting with a problem in behavior, then here's an idea on some things that you can do for specially designed instruction. So you'll see at the bottom of the screen, it says explicit instruction and self-talk, right? So we're modeling, we're teaching that. And remember, we go back to that process. We model it. We give them some guided practice with that. Maybe we have some models in the classroom. We let them work in a small group. We let them practice saying positive things like, yes, I can do this. And then we're gonna let them practice it on their own in the school setting. And then we can take data on that. So this document has those 3 columns in it for multiple behaviors. And you can see there's the potential SDI for this target area. And then here's some steps that I can use for specially designed instruction. And then you'll see on the column on the right, the resources. Those are all links to access some actual resources. So if you're trying to address a particular behavior, then you can use this resource. And you'll notice if you have gotten that open, you can see that there's all kinds of strategies and resources that you can use. And I'll flip back here to this one. So this one, you can see that there's on task, task completion, and on task behavior, and all of those blue links are hyperlinked. I'm going to scroll on down, and if a student is having organizational issues, they may be having issues with executive functioning. And so the behavior is not completing tasks or they're not prepared for class. That might be particular for our students that have a cognitive deficit, our students with a specific learning disability, our students that have other health impairment. So those might be some strategies that you might use for them with organization. And then like working independently. And so the whole document is available for you, and you can just bookmark this. This is open, and it's also on our website, so you can access it too. But you can find this in the link. And if after we finish, if you can always email any of us here at KVEC and get this resource as well. But I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint and we're going to try a practice an activity. So I'm going to bring one up on the screen. So we have a student, his name is Jordan, and I'm going to let you all do this work. So Jordan's in the 6th grade, and he refuses to follow directions, especially during transitions. So when he's in classroom transitions or they're doing any kind of group activity, this is what happens. He refuses to do the work. He'll say, I don't want to. Why should I have to? And then the teacher might repeat, and he ignores the instruction. And he has to have lots of redirection. And then whenever the teacher asks what's happening, he says that the activity is boring. And every day it continues to increase every day when it's a task that he has to pay attention and follow through. So if you were going to use this tool, especially this SDI toolkit, and you were trying to find specially designed instruction for Jordan, what would you use? If we look on here, not following directions, remember that was one of our prompts in here. What is it that we're going to have him do? What would we do for specially designed instruction? All right, so if you look over on your SDI toolkit, it's over there on following directions. It's kind of midway through. Okay, anybody have a suggestion?
One of the things I was going to think, was thinking about, Dionne, I could see this happening in my class when I was a teacher. And I would continue to use verbal redirection, but the verbal redirection was the attention that he was seeking. Mm-hmm. And so you have to think about something else. So you're going to have to teach them explicitly some things there. And of course, the toolkit should provide those things, but some of the things that this student might need, it could be a first and then kind of schedule, like mm-hmm. this is first and then this is what comes next, and or kind of if then kind of thing, and then sometimes maybe some different choices, an alternative. I'll provide the student with the alternative choices, or it may be as simple as just using some transitional cues. If the student's having trouble with transition, can you teach them some cues, or can you give them an opportunity to decompress a little bit and calm down before they choose to just not do what you're asking them to do? Mm-hmm. So just kind of redirect and reteaching them some things without using the verbal piece.
I also think what you were talking about, Dean Paul, the cueing system too. If you'll look and on the SDI toolkit, when you get to the following directions section, and it's on over just a little bit in that document, but it says use a queuing system. So let's say that he has a cue about when it's time to start task, or maybe he has a cue that means I need help, right? He gives a signal because he's not following directions, or he's having difficulty because he can't remember those. So maybe he has a task card on his desk or a card that says I need help, right? Maybe remember we talked about those little tent cards on the desk. There's green, I'm good to go. Yellow, I need assistance. Or red, stop. Right there, you can use all kinds of cues. And in this toolkit, you'll see that there's links to those. So you'll identify what the skill is they want. You're going to break that skill down in there. And what you're asking him to do is following directions. And so you may have to do, just like you said, a first, then. You may have to give them pre-correct. Just remember, you can teach them before we start this task. Remember, we ask for assistance. This is how we ask for help, or we raise our hand, or we use a cue. Like one finger up means I'm good. I need help, or whatever. Or two needs, I can ask a friend. Lots of different opportunities. But the reason I wanted to share it was, once we have all of those problem behaviors, and sometimes it's hard to come up with ideas about what we can use, and we'll have an idea and then it doesn't necessarily work or change or shape that behavior in the way we want it to happen. So we have to find another strategy. And the toolkit and the specially designed instruction for that is also just a great resource to have. Where do we go to find those resources that we need when we need them, when we're thinking about writing those, we have to decide, does a student need a behavior plan? How are we giving those interventions? And sometimes we have regular ed teachers that ask us about what are some interventions that we could do for behavior, and we can share these tools with them as well. So this was just one that the state group worked on to help all teachers. And here's an example of Alex, and we'll finish here with Alex. So let's say we have Alex, who is a student that has aggressive behavior. So he's hitting and kicking during unstructured time, right? During breaks. So he hits, and so we're saying hitting, we have to define exactly what that means that he's doing. Or if he's kicking, what does that mean? Is he taking his leg and he's making contact with another student on their leg? Is he biting? And so what kind of specially designed instruction are we going to do with Alex? What would we choose to do with him if he was having those aggressive behaviors? So Regina says in the chat that they have a student that hits, and they've implemented a safe hands cue to him. So they're going to use a cueing system. So if you're writing that, if you're looking at that student's goal, and that hitting is defined, and then they have a cueing system, that becomes the specially designed instruction. So you're going to be able to measure that. You're going to be able to measure how many times that he responds to the cue, or how many times that you've had to use the cue, right? So those are ways that we think about providing that, the specially designed instruction. And I bet you have to model that, Regina, probably multiple times. And sometimes they may forget, and you have to come back and remind them. Yes, right. So you have to remember to give them that, go back to thinking about that modeling. Remember, this is what it means to model, or we pre-correct, or we teach that, or we remind them, okay, before we go down the hallway, we remember that hands to ourselves, or we have like you said, a cue card. That means that you keep your hands wherever you have them directed to do that. All right. So there's probably some skills that you're going to have to teach, right? Explicit instruction, yes, with regulation, right? So you're going to have to talk about self-regulation, because he might be impulsive. That might be what's happening. It could be frustration. Absolutely, Teresa. Those are good. So we also always think about that specially designed instruction is how we're going to very explicitly teach them the appropriate behavior. So
Dr. Bates, I hear it all the time from teachers. The students don't have coping strategies. Mm-hmm. We so often look for external ways to manage behavior, get students on task, those types of things. But explicitly teaching them replacement behaviors for that. If they're aggressive, it could be that they're displaying frustration, or they don't understand what's going on, or they're avoiding something, or they're trying to get attention. Those are the three big pieces I think about. So what can we teach them? Can we teach them to raise their hand instead of hitting someone? Can we teach them to calm? Do some calming strategies, those types of things. That's what I think about. Mm-hmm. And I hear it so often that we're always saying, okay, let's get them out of the classroom. Let's get them a prescription. But we fail to think about, hey, can we try to teach explicitly what they need to be doing in place of those behaviors? And it's hard. There's no question about it. It's very, very difficult.
It is. Yes. Jessica dropped in the chat social stories. And that's a great one, right? About how we're teaching that behavior, how we're reshaping those behaviors, or how we're addressing those aggressive behaviors. And I think, Jessica, you probably also say how often you have to do that and to reinforce that as you're teaching those social stories. We appreciate you being here with us.